O Lord, you are the one who searches deep within us, way beyond the way things appear. You look into our hearts. And so this morning allow us to be open to your search, to respond to your call, and to be brought back to the heart of worship, which is all about you. Amen. Please be seated. Around Wednesday or Thursday each week, I normally get moaned at by somebody in the office about the length of the readings, because they're trying to put the notice sheet together. So I got plenty of earache this week because they're both quite long. However, I just want you to know that the Nehemiah reading is severely edited back. I would have cheerfully given you 3 verses of it. And we had terrible trouble deciding what to leave out and what to put in. It's a bit like one of those fabulous buffets, you know, when you go along and you think, I really could do all of this justice if only my belly was big enough. So you might find this morning that the focus that you pick up is not from that particular passage, but it may be. And more importantly, you may find that Nehemiah raises for us again more questions than he seems to answer. More questions of us, of our hearts, of our motivation. So whilst our focus in this morning is on the celebrations, on the completion of the rebuilt walls, the fulfilling of Nehemiah's vision, if I look at the 3 chapters, 11, 12 and 13, it's much more about a community. Chapter 11 is about the repopulating of Jerusalem. It had been a ruined and down-at-heel city on a hill. It meant that people had given up on the city and gone out through the kingdoms of Judah, Benjamin and beyond. The towns and villages had benefited at the expense of Jerusalem. And here, as part of the rebuilding of the city, these towns and villages are literally decimated. They're decimaled. They took 1/10 of the people. They identify them in a list and they say, we need you over there in the rebuilt city. And everyone is called to that Old Testament biblical principle of tithing 1/10 to the work. Now, the trouble with lists in Scripture is they look a bit tedious, especially if they're of names that we don't think we can pronounce. And we can dismiss them as a bit tedious. But if you go back and look at chapter 11, just before you dismiss the list of the names of the families who moved to Jerusalem in obedience, remember they moved in obedience, lock, stock and barrel, to the rebuilt city and a new life. Some of us perhaps understand that better than others. So when you read it, pause for a minute with those names, especially if you're a bit resistant to any sense that home or neighbourhood might be temporary. For ultimately, all homes on earth are temporary. But when the call came, as it does, they were called to make that step of faith. I just wonder, do you know, about half the people who worship here and see St Stephen's as their church don't live in our parish. Don't quite know what that says. It's true for a lot of churches. It's not peculiar to us. But can you imagine the effect if the PCC had a meeting and decided that it needed more people to live in the parish? And several of you got a letter saying, we'd be grateful if you'd make arrangements to move into the parish in the next 3 months, please. I wonder what our reaction would be. And of course, not only was it a challenge to do that, it was a challenge to take on a new role. People were given tasks to do. And all this is happening because Nehemiah was a man of prayer. He'd had this vision and he had turned it into reality. A vision rooted in prayer. And there were obedient people like those in the lists in chapter 11. They were needed too. For without them, the vision would have been lost. It would have been a white elephant of rebuilt walls with no life. This is obedience that comes from prayerful faith. So are we open to hear such a challenge? Who of us here are called to be the Nehemiahs that we all need to listen to because they grasp God's vision? And who of us here are those who are called to obediently change their lives or even their homes to fulfill that vision? And so to chapter 12, the focus today. Chapter 12, in fact, starts with another list, one that warms my heart. It's a list of priestly and Levitical families. There's one over there on the wall. A list of the vicars of St. Stephen's. It seems important in churches to have lists like that. I treasure a picture I have from the 50th anniversary here with me and my predecessors standing together here, 5 vicars of the same church. And I vividly remember the awe and wonder when my vicar, who was training me as a curate, pointed out that here he was on a list that was unbroken from the 12th century. So chapter 12 begins with a list. And those families listed were lines of unbroken service through generations. Generations of unbroken service from families serving the faith. I wonder if there's something about our understanding we could relearn from that. Last year in Nazareth, we were in Nazareth, my daughter and I, and an acquaintance of hers, a Palestinian who lives in Nazareth, was with us. And I said, trying to be caring and interested, "Oh, and how long have your family always lived in Nazareth?" "Oh no," she said, "we've only lived here 150 years. My family has only lived here 150 years. I think it was last year when the Chinese premier was visiting Europe, and some wise guy, mindful of what's been going on in China in the last few years, asked the Chinese premier what he thought about the French Revolution and its effects. And the reply was, "I think it's too early to tell yet." A different perspective. Perhaps sometimes that's what we're challenged with. So let's go to our reading, to the celebrations of the rebuilt walls. And they start with the theme of music. Music features strongly in these accounts. So they needed plenty of musicians and singers to make their worship effective. Not much changes then. But before they got going, there was a need for cleansing or purification. Verse 30. Yesterday here was a day of prayer. A day, for me at least, of realizing what it was I needed to let go of in me in order for God to have his way. I'm deeply grateful to those who enabled that day. It was a very powerful day, I know, for a number of us. And in our reading here, this talks not just of a cleansing of a self, a personal faith, but a cleansing of a place in order that it was fit for worship and the celebration of God. Now, they weren't about the cleansing of a room where they were going to meet and worship. They were cleansing a city. These were the walls and everything they encompassed. In common worship, the liturgies the Church of England use since the year 2000, there is a little section that I suspect is less used than anything else. It's called a form of preparation. A little liturgy for us to use before we start to worship, to prepare ourselves to worship. A sense, if you like, of purification. Here, each week, we come together. And the service there's always a buzz here, isn't there? The busyness of people gathering, especially people who haven't seen each other for a week or so. And we try in our different ways to create a stilled space before our worship begins. Increasingly these days our musicians call us to worship as they sing, as our service begins. Perhaps there's something in there for us. Is there something of purification for us? Are we properly prepared to worship? Is this place prepared as it needs to be for worship? And then there are the celebrations themselves. This is where we did a lot of editing. Verse 31 tells us that one of the companies, one of the groups, went to the right. There are then 6 more verses of detail telling us who they were and what they did. And then in verse 38, which you haven't got now, it says, the other company of those who gave thanks went to the left, and I, Nehemiah, followed them with half of the people on the wall above the tower of the ovens to the broad wall, and then there's 5 or 6 verses of detail. If you've still got the leaflet from the first sermon, you could follow it on your map of the walls. The order and composition of these processions was very carefully planned. In fact, they're generally carefully planned in services. You might not realise it, but actually the order we come in is carefully planned. It has a purpose and a symbolism. And I'm a bit of a logistics freak, so if there's a big service at the cathedral, I always enjoy getting the insider order of service. If you've never seen the insider order of service at the cathedral, it's one with all the stage directions in. It tells you who has to be where, when, and so forth, and they have to go and they have to be in this order, and they need to go there, and at this point they need to move there, and so forth. Some of our servers know about that stuff. To some people that's all just a bit tedious, a list. But it's about where they walk, how they walk. The symbolism of order and status are buried in the planning and the thinking, just as other aspects of our worship are planned. It'd be nice to think that we just met together at about 20 past 10 every morning, prayed together, and the act of worship came together. But it isn't quite like that. We actually put a lot of effort and thought, all of us, into putting that act of worship together. It's planned. Our music's planned, the order of service is planned, the slides are planned, it's all put together. So was that procession around the walls. Planned to include and allow God to work. Just pause there for a moment. If we plan too exclusively, if we plan so well that we cannot countenance any change, any error, any variation, we are in grave danger of preventing the movement of God through His Spirit. Conversely, a complete lack of planning can result in worship not only being and feeling chaotic, I can think of a few services I've been to, but it could end up with the service moving forward at the whim of someone who may or may not be open to God's will or desire for the people that are there. We have to plan a God space. But here we are. There they were, going around the walls from 2 sides, coming back together, rejoicing, celebrating, making a wonderful noise, waking everybody in the neighbourhood up, celebrating that Nehemiah's vision has come to fulfilment. What a wonderful climax. What a wonderful way to end the book of Nehemiah, with it starting with his distress at the state of the holy city. At last we have the celebrations for its completion. All is well. What a lovely place to end the book. Only that isn't where it ends. There's some more. The celebrations on the walls are not the end, for we are part of an ongoing story. We don't have a project so we can all brush our hands, say, well done, chums, let's go and do something else. We're going to move on. The story continues. For Nehemiah throughout, it seems to me, is a book of messy reality. Yes, with tedious lists and difficult objectors. But it is more powerfully, for me, an account of a prayerful battle between the will of God and the will of his enemies. So in the final verse, the uncomfortable chapter 13, in the final chapter, chapter 13, there are problems on the tail of these celebrations. There's an underlying problem to be addressed. And there are problems of unreliable people not keeping up the standards. The underlying problem is one that the Jews were facing and still are. Their problem: how do I deal with non-Jews? How can I interact with foreigners? The pressing issues were the presence of those who didn't keep the law because they weren't Jews. And their influence was a real problem. And then there was the problem for them of mixed marriages. So it's addressed in chapter 13. But it's about so much more than Jew and Gentile, a problem that still exists. It's about acknowledging the Christ of our gospel reading. The Christ who in our gospel reading does not condemn the Samaritans, does not condemn the one who works outside of the group. Let him get on with it. And even those who reject him aren't condemned to some damnation. Yes, Jesus moves on, but he offers them, as he offers us, salvation. The Christ who came for all, Jew and Gentile. So what could that say to us in a world that suffers prejudice and aggression in so many places? Prejudice and aggression against those who are not like us. Or as I've often heard to say, what a shame they're not all perfect like me. And yet, we need to beware. Look at the aftermath of the uprisings that continue across North Africa and the Middle East. Look at the reflections of major powers who realise that the people in those lands are different. Perhaps they don't think like a Western nation. Perhaps they don't make decisions or operate like us. We struggle to understand. We live in a multinational, multi-faith, multicultural community. I have Sikhs and Muslims living doors away from me as good neighbours. People from all over the world. Yet last week, was it only last week, I made a joke of the fact that our Wesseling visitors always stand to pray and sit to sing, because that's what they do in Germany. And yet they are the community, the faith, the culture, the history in a land which is as much like ours as any in the world. And we struggle with our differences. So how do we deal with difference and diversity and disagreement? Where are our times to integrate and our times to separate? But perhaps more disturbing and more easy for us to identify with is the other part of chapter 13, just to complete this story. Nehemiah, it seems, having had all his celebrations on the walls, is called back to Persia for a bit, where remember he came from, and King Artaxerxes and all that stuff. And he comes back to Jerusalem and he finds that while the cat's been away, the mice have been up to no good. Things have slipped. All is not well. The chief culprit, as so often, is one of the top men left in charge, Eliashib. He seems to have allowed a space in the temple to become a place of business. And further, people like the Levites and the priests and the musicians and the singers have not been given their dues. And the practices and the observance of the Sabbath have all slipped. Nothing we recognise there, is there? Well, whatever we might think, this is a house of prayer, a place of worship where God's people gather. So for one, we have to be continually alert for what that means for us to maintain that and enable it. In the last year or so, we've really tried to establish a raised awareness of the need for us to be a praying church. Yesterday, a day of prayer. We have daily morning prayers. We have twice weekly times to pray. We have a parish prayer diary. But it needs more than just that planning, just as their celebrations did. It needs people to participate. The celebrations on the walls are nothing if nobody comes. Having a church with a prayerful program is no good if nobody prays. And when we get it wrong, we have to be bold enough to see that we got it wrong and to move on. And today you were given another leaflet, another prayer initiative, an effort for us all to know how to ensure that prayer gets done and things get prayed for. So we need to gather regularly. But it's difficult in a world where secular values are increasingly at variance with those of the Christians. Regular participation in church activities is a struggle. Long working hours, 6-day weeks, the demands of a family, and that's just the vicar. Sunday morning football, family gatherings, having at least one day in the week to stop and pause. All these things and so much more lead people not to be in church, not to gather together. And some people are so worn out by their church busyness from Monday to Saturday, at least on Sunday they can get a break from it. Did you realise that the average committed church attender comes every other week? You might like to pause with your diary and count how many Sundays you've been and how many you've missed. It's quite scary. Now there's a thought. Could it be that we have to drop something? And it might not be something outside of church. It might be something in the church that keeps us from focusing on prayer and worship and coming together. And what does it mean for us to keep Sabbath? To keep a seventh day for being with God and to desist from worldly stuff? Well, as we reflect on these many questions, let's look at our gospel reading. For the disciples argued, and so will we. But how do we resolve our issues? Who is listening to God's vision and bold enough to obediently follow it? And then there's this point of having a childlike faith that seems so vital. That means I trust even though I don't understand. And in this church we are privileged to have the children as models. They trust, and so must we. Oh, and then do we see ourselves as equal in the eyes of God, or are some of us more superior than others? Can the arrogant and the proud hear that? Can the self-deprecating who feel they're unworthy hear that? For everyone has a role. Go read Nehemiah. Have you found your role? If not, what are you going to do about it? I wonder where you'd be in one of Nehemiah's lists. And will we leave alone? Will we let go of that which does not work? That where words and deeds fall on deaf ears and deaf hearts. Not move on with damnation and criticism and pain and... No, just leave it and move on. But most of all, will we move on? Will we move as individuals? Will we move as families? Will we move as a church to where God calls us? Move when He calls, not when it suits us. And move on His terms and not ours. For we're told we must go with no regrets, but with rejoicing. For no one who puts a hand to the plough and looks back is fit for the kingdom. So the book of Nehemiah has so much to challenge us with. So I finish with Nehemiah's final words, a short prayer. Perhaps one we can all echo. Remember me, O my God, for good. Amen.